You're sitting at a dinner table with your family, and someone starts crying. Maybe your mom is upset. Maybe your parents are arguing. And instead of feeling scared or confused like a child normally would, you immediately scan the room, calculating who needs what, figuring out how to make the tension disappear before it gets worse. You were never told to do this. No one assigned you the role. But somehow, from a very young age, you just knew it was your job. You knew when someone was lying before they finished their sentence. You knew how to shrink yourself in a room to keep the peace. You knew how to take care of everyone else's feelings while burying your own somewhere so deep that you eventually forgot they were even there. And here's the strange part. People always told you how mature you were. They said it like it was a compliment, like you had won something. So the question is, does any of this feel familiar to you? Because if it does, what you're carrying is far heavier than most people will ever understand, and this video is for you. Now, most people look at the child who grew up too fast and see something admirable. They see someone who is responsible, self-sufficient, emotionally intelligent, and wise beyond their years. Parents brag about them. Teachers give them gold stars. Friends call them the reliable one. And on the surface, all of that is true. Those qualities are real and they are genuinely valuable. But here is what nobody tells you. Those qualities didn't come from a healthy place. They came from survival. The maturity that everyone admired was never a gift you freely developed. It was a coping mechanism your nervous system built under pressure because you had no other choice. It was your brain learning to adapt to an environment where acting like a child wasn't safe, where vulnerability had a cost, and where being too much might push the people you loved further away. And so, the very thing the world celebrated in you, your emotional intelligence, your calm, your ability to handle things, is also the thing that quietly exhausted you, isolated you, and taught you that your own needs were an inconvenience. That's not maturity. That's parentification. That's emotional labor extracted from someone who was still learning how to tie their shoes. So where does this come from? Why do some children end up carrying the emotional weight of entire households while others get to simply be kids? Psychology points to two main pathways, and understanding which one applies to you isn't about assigning blame. It's about finally making sense of a story that has probably confused you for a long time. The most common origin is environmental. Something in your home required you to grow up before you were ready. Maybe one or both of your parents struggled with mental illness, addiction, chronic illness, or emotional instability. And in the absence of a stable adult, you became the stable one. Maybe you grew up in poverty or in a home where conflict was constant, and your child's brain learned very quickly that being hyper-aware and hyper-responsible was the only way to feel even a little bit safe. Maybe you had a younger sibling you had to protect. Maybe your parent leaned on you emotionally, venting to you about their problems, treating you more like a confidant than a child, which is a pattern called emotional parentification. In all of these situations, your nervous system did something remarkable. It adapted. It rewired itself to prioritize the needs of others, to read emotional cues with precision, and to suppress your own distress so you could function. Think of it like a young tree that grows sideways because a wall is blocking its light. It's not broken, it's resourceful. But that sideways growth has consequences that the tree carries for the rest of its life. The second pathway is biological. Some children are simply born more sensitive, more empathetic, and more attuned to the emotional states of the people around them. Research in developmental psychology suggests that certain children have a nervous system that is fundamentally more reactive, meaning they feel everything more intensely, they notice what others miss, and they are more affected by emotional disruption in their environment. When a highly sensitive child grows up in a chaotic or emotionally demanding home, the combination is particularly intense. Their natural temperament amplifies the weight of the environment, and the environment exploits their natural sensitivity. The result is a child who becomes an expert in everyone else's inner world while remaining a complete stranger to their own. And here is the most important thing to understand, regardless of which pathway or combination of both applies to you. You are not broken. You are not weak. You are not too sensitive, or too intense, or too much.
You were simply a child who was given responsibilities that were never meant to be yours, and you carried them because that's what children do when they love the people around them and have no other tools. What happened to you was not your fault, and the way you adapted was not a flaw. It was intelligence under pressure. Now, let's talk about what this actually looks like in your daily life, because the child who grew up too fast doesn't disappear when they turn 18. They grow up and carry every pattern, every strategy, every wound right into their adult relationships, their careers, and their sense of self. These are the signs that the child inside you is still running on survival mode. The first one is what I call the emotional radar. The scientific concept here is called hypervigilance, a state of heightened sensory sensitivity where your nervous system is constantly scanning for danger, specifically emotional danger. For you, it doesn't present as jumping at loud noises. It presents as being able to walk into a room and immediately sense that something is off before anyone has said a word. You notice the slight tension in someone's jaw, the way someone's laugh sounds a little too forced, the 2-second pause before your partner answers a simple question. You read subtext like other people read headlines. And while this makes you incredibly perceptive and valuable in many contexts, the emotional consequence is exhausting because your brain never gets to fully relax. It is always quietly running threat assessments on every social environment you enter, whether or not there is anything to actually be afraid of. Connected to that is the second sign, the approval hunger. The scientific concept underneath this one is called conditional positive regard, a term coined by psychologist Carl Rogers to describe an upbringing where love and acceptance were not freely given but had to be earned through performance, compliance, or emotional labor. When you grew up in a home where your value was tied to how well you managed things, how mature you were, how little trouble you caused, you internalized the belief that you are worthy only when you are useful. So, as an adult, you find yourself working twice as hard as everyone else at the office, not because of ambition, but because some part of you still believes that the moment you stop performing, people will stop valuing you. You fish for feedback. You feel disproportionately devastated by criticism. You replay conversations for days, wondering if you said the wrong thing. And the result is a constant low-grade anxiety that sits beneath the surface of even your most successful moments, because no amount of external validation ever quite reaches the wound underneath. Which brings us to the third sign, the caretaker default. You don't just help people, you organize your entire life around their needs. You are the friend who remembers everyone's appointments, who shows up first in a crisis, who knows what everyone in your life needs before they finished asking. You are the partner who anticipates, adjusts, accommodates. And you do this not because it feels joyful, but because sitting with someone else's unmet need activates a kind of internal alarm that you cannot ignore. The psychological term for this is the Fawn response, a survival strategy identified by therapist Pete Walker as a fourth trauma response alongside fight, flight, and freeze. The Fawn response is what happens when a child learns that the safest way to avoid danger is to please. And the emotional consequence is profound, because you have spent so long taking care of everyone else's needs, you have almost no practice identifying, articulating, or advocating for your own. And that's exactly why the fourth sign hits so hard, the difficulty receiving. Here's something quietly painful about the child who grew up too fast. They are extraordinarily good at giving and almost completely unable to receive. Someone offers to help you move apartments and you feel a confusing flash of guilt. Your partner wants to take care of you when you're sick and you find yourself apologizing for being a burden. A friend notices you seem off and asks if you're okay, and instead of saying, "No, actually I'm struggling," you deflect with, "I'm fine, it's nothing." The psychological mechanism here involves what researchers call role confusion. When a child is placed in a caretaking role, they lose the experience of being cared for, and receiving care as an adult feels unfamiliar, undeserved, or even dangerous. There is a voice somewhere inside you that says needing things is weakness, that depending on people is dangerous, that people will eventually leave if you become too much of a burden. So you keep yourself small, keep your needs invisible, and keep giving, because that, at least, is ground you know. Running alongside all of this is the fifth sign, the inability to rest. You don't know how to do nothing. When you try to take a day off, you last about 40 minutes before the anxiety starts creeping in, a restless, uncomfortable feeling that you should be doing something, producing something, fixing something. Vacations feel vaguely wrong. Sitting still feels irresponsible. Even enjoyment comes with a low-level guilt, as if you haven't yet earned the right to relax. This is because your nervous system learned during those formative years that your value was tied to your output. A child who grows up needing to be responsible, productive, and functional doesn't develop a secure relationship with rest. They develop a relationship with productivity as safety. The emotional consequence is that you are almost always running, even when you're standing still. And the exhaustion that builds from years of this kind of living goes far deeper than any amount of sleep can touch. And beneath the exhaustion, there is something even quieter, the sixth sign, which I call the identity fog. Ask yourself this question: not what you do, not what you're good at, not how other people would describe you, but who are you when nobody needs anything from you?
What do you actually enjoy? What do you want, not what you think you should want, not what would make someone else happy? What you want, purely for yourself. If that question makes you feel strangely blank, if you realize that you've spent so much of your life adapting to other people's needs that you never quite developed a stable sense of your own desires, interests, and preferences, that is one of the quieter but most profound wounds of growing up too fast. Psychologists call this a diffuse identity, a sense of self that was formed almost entirely in relation to others, and which becomes destabilized when those relational roles are removed. You know who you are as a caretaker, as a problem solver, as the reliable one, but who are you as just a person? The seventh sign lives right next to that emptiness, the fear of burdening others. You would rather suffer in silence for 3 weeks than send a single text that says, "I'm not doing well." You rehearse your sentences before asking for even small things. You apologize before making any request, as if your need itself is already an imposition. And when someone does offer you support, there's a part of you that immediately starts calculating whether you've already used up your quota, as if care were a finite resource that you could run out of by needing too much. The root of this is straightforward. As a child, you witnessed or experienced what happens when someone needs too much. Maybe it overwhelmed a parent who was already overwhelmed. Maybe it pushed someone away. Maybe it made the room feel heavier. And so your nervous system made a rule it still follows today, that the safest thing you can do is need as little as possible. That rule is what drives the eighth sign, the hyper-independence. You researched the car repair yourself instead of asking your mechanic friend for help. You figured out your taxes alone rather than letting your partner walk you through them. You processed the loss, the disappointment, the heartbreak entirely by yourself because the idea of bringing it to someone else felt like too much. This isn't self-reliance in the healthy sense. This is what psychologists call compulsive self-reliance, a pattern described extensively by attachment theorist John Bowlby. It develops in children who learned early on that depending on others is unreliable or even dangerous. The emotional consequence is a loneliness that is entirely self-constructed. You have built walls not out of coldness, but out of the deeply held belief that the only person you can truly count on is yourself.
And the terrible irony is that the more capable and self-sufficient you appear on the outside, the more invisible your actual loneliness becomes. The ninth sign shows up most clearly in close relationships, the difficulty with conflict. Most people who grew up too fast have a complicated relationship with conflict, specifically a deep, almost physical aversion to it. When someone around you raises their voice, your chest tightens before you've even processed what's being said. When a relationship goes quiet, you immediately assume the worst and begin running through everything you might have done wrong. And when you actually need to express a grievance of your own, you often find yourself unable to do it. Either you minimize it, it's not a big deal, or you build it up internally until it explodes in a way that surprises everyone, including you. The developmental explanation here is that conflict in your formative environment was not safe. It either escalated unpredictably, or it meant that love was being withdrawn, or it meant that someone you depended on would be destabilized. So your nervous system learned to avoid it at almost any cost, and that avoidance followed you directly into every relationship you've had since. And then there is the 10th sign, one that most people never even recognize as a sign at all, the grief you never got to have. There is a specific kind of grief that belongs to the child who grew up too fast, and most of them have never actually allowed themselves to feel it. It is the grief for the childhood they didn't get to have. The grief for the 10-year-old who was trying to manage a parent's anxiety instead of playing outside. The grief for a teenager who was being someone's emotional support system instead of figuring out who they were. It is the grief for a kid who never really got to be a kid and who may not have even realized that was a loss until much, much later. The reason this grief is so often suppressed is that it comes packaged with guilt, because you love your family, because things could have been worse, because they did the best they could. And all of those things can be true, and the loss can still be real. The grief and the love are not opposites. They can exist in the same chest at the same time. But here's where it gets more complex, and this is the layer that most conversations about this topic never reach. When all of the patterns described above persist long enough, something else starts to happen in the brain. The nervous system, which has spent years operating in survival mode, begins to experience a kind of identity collapse around the very mechanisms it developed to stay safe. In other words, the strategies that protected you as a child start to damage you as an adult, and your brain begins to defend those strategies with a ferocity that makes change feel genuinely terrifying. The most common defense mechanism that emerges is what psychologists call emotional compartmentalization, the ability to shut off your own emotional experience so completely that you can function perfectly in a crisis while something inside you slowly dies. You become masterful at it. You can attend a funeral and be the one organizing the food and making sure everyone has a ride home while your own grief sits untouched in a sealed room somewhere. You can go through a devastating breakup and be back at work the next day, fully functional, because the alternative, actually feeling it, doesn't feel safe. And here is the particular cruelty of this pattern. Because you appear so fine, the people around you assume you are fine. They stop checking in.
They stop asking. And you, who were never taught how to ask for help, don't reach out. The result is a loneliness that exists not in spite of your connections, but right in the middle of them. A loneliness of being seen as strong when you are breaking, of performing competence when you are desperate for someone to just tell you to sit down and rest. There is also a feedback loop that develops in relationships specifically. Because you are hyper-attuned to other people's needs, and because you tend to minimize your own, you tend to attract and stay in dynamics where you are the giver and the other person is the receiver. This feels familiar and therefore comfortable until you reach a point of exhaustion and resentment, at which point you often do one of two things. You either shut down and withdraw entirely, or you finally express your needs in such an urgent, overwhelming way that it frightens the person on the other side. Neither outcome reinforces your ability to be vulnerable. Both reinforce the original belief that needing things is dangerous, that depending on people leads to disappointment, and that the safest place is behind the glass wall of your own competence. So, what do you actually do with all of this? Here is something important to name right at the start. You cannot simply decide to stop being this way. You cannot wake up tomorrow and choose to be less hypervigilant, less of a caretaker, less self-sufficient. These patterns were built over years of lived experience, and they live in your nervous system, not just in your thoughts. The solution is not to become less of who you are. The solution is to slowly, gradually, give the younger version of you the things they never received, and to begin building new patterns alongside the old ones, until the new ones become strong enough to carry you. The first principle is learning to distinguish between the past and the present. The single most important cognitive shift you can begin to make is learning to notice when your nervous system is responding to the present moment and when it is responding to an old memory. When your partner is quiet over dinner and you immediately begin spiraling, rehearsing every conversation from the last week, looking for the thing you did wrong, your body is not responding to a quiet evening. It is responding to the feeling of a parent going silent before something bad happened. Those are two different situations, separated by 20 years, but your nervous system is treating them as one. A practical way to begin interrupting this is to name it out loud, even just to yourself. My brain is responding as if this is dangerous. Let me check whether it actually is. This is not about dismissing your feelings. It is about gently reminding the part of you that is still a child that you are an adult now, and you have more capacity to handle things than you did back then. The second principle is practicing receiving in small doses. Rebuilding your capacity to receive care is not something that happens in one grand moment of vulnerability. It happens in micro moments, repeated over time. It means allowing a friend to pick up the bill without immediately planning how you'll pay them back. It means answering "How are you?" with something slightly more honest than "Fine." It means letting your body stay in someone's hug for a second longer than feels comfortable. Each of these small acts sends a message to your nervous system. Receiving does not mean you are weak, and people do not leave when you have needs. The emotional consequence of consistently practicing this over months and years is profound, not because you'll suddenly become someone who effortlessly leans on others, but because you'll slowly expand the range of what feels safe, and that range is where genuine intimacy lives. The third principle is renegotiating your relationship with your own needs. For much of your life, your needs have operated on a system of suppression and explosion. You ignore them until you can't, and then they erupt in ways that feel disproportionate and embarrassing. The alternative to that system is not to suddenly express every feeling immediately. It is to begin developing the skill of identifying and articulating your needs in real time before they reach critical mass. This starts with something as simple as building a daily check-in with yourself. What am I feeling right now? What do I actually need right now? Not what does everyone else need, not what would be most convenient, but what do I need? You do not have to share the answer to anyone. You just need to practice the habit of asking the question, because the child who grew up too fast never learned to ask it, and learning it now as an adult is one of the most radical acts of self-recovery available to you. The child who grew up too fast doesn't stay a child forever. They grow up, and they carry everything with them: the empathy that was forged in the fire of watching people they loved struggle, the strength that was built from carrying things that were too heavy, the perceptiveness that came from learning to read rooms before they could read words. None of that disappears. None of that was a mistake. But here is what changes. It stops being something that happens to you and starts being something you choose. The hyper-awareness that used to exhaust you becomes, with practice, a genuine gift you offer intentionally rather than a tax you pay constantly. The capacity for care that once left you empty becomes, when protected by healthy limits, one of the most powerful forms of love you can give. Think of it this way. You spent years being a container, holding everything for everyone, leaving nothing for yourself. The work now is not to stop being a container. It is to make sure that you are also being filled. The same depth that made you so good at caring for others makes you capable of extraordinary things, including, finally, learning to care for yourself with even a fraction of the tenderness you have given to everyone else. That child inside you was never broken. They were extraordinary. They just needed someone to finally look them in the eyes and say, "You've done enough. You can rest now. Someone is here." If something in this video landed for you, if you found yourself nodding along and recognizing patterns you've never quite had words for before, leave a comment below with one sign that resonated the most with you, because I want to know which part of this story you're living, and because reading those comments reminds every single person watching that they are not as alone in this as they feel. And if there is someone in your life, a friend, a partner, a sibling, who is always the one holding everything together, who never asks for help, who everyone calls so mature or so strong, please share this video with them, because sometimes the most important thing we can do for the people we love is to hand them the words for what they've been carrying. Drop your rising sign in the comments too. I have a feeling the ones who resonate most with this video know exactly which placement is responsible.